Germany's Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock is visiting China. She met with her counterpart Qin Gang in Beijing. The two discussed China's tensions with Taiwan, Beijing's human rights record, and the war in Ukraine. Baerbock called on China to exert its influence on Russia to end its war in Ukraine.
German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock on her inaugural visit to China. After landing in the port city of Tianjin on Thursday, Baerbock put the tough topics on the table in Beijing. The war in Ukraine is high on Berlin's agenda. Baerbock called on China to use its influence with Russia to end the invasion.
It is good that China has signaled its commitment to a solution, but I have to say frankly that I wonder why, so far, the Chinese position hasn't included a call on Russia, the aggressor, to stop the war.
Beijing, which sees itself as a mediator in the conflict, reiterated it would not send weapons to its Russian ally.
Regarding the export of military products, China adopts a prudent and responsible attitude. China will not provide weapons to relevant parties of the conflict and will manage and control the export of items with civilian and military uses in accordance with laws and regulations.
Another key issue up for discussion, tensions between China and Taiwan. Days after Beijing staged war games around the self-governing island, Baerbock said an escalation in the Taiwan Strait would be a horror scenario for the entire world. In response, China said it doesn't allow any foreign intervention on the matter. But there are issues the two sides agree on, strengthening economic and trade cooperation. Earlier, Baerbock toured German companies based in Tianjin. Talks with Wang Yi, China's most senior foreign policy official, are scheduled before her departure.
More on this story. Let's bring in Marina Henke. She's director of the Center for International Security at the Hertie School here in Berlin. Thanks for being with us. Marina, China's foreign minister says his country will not send weapons to Russia to use in its war against Ukraine. Should Ukraine and its allies be comforted by that?
Well, of course, it's good news. But by the way, China has been saying this for a while. And there was an official statement made in March. And so, it's not necessarily Annalena Baerbock's visit in Beijing that, kind of cleared that aspect. It's something that, was kind of known already before. But yes, in the big picture of things, that's, of course, good news.
Do you believe it?
I do believe it. I think China knows that the entire global dynamics, and in particular Europe's role in this war, would very much escalate in the sense of that, right now, China hopes that still some European countries are willing to, take a somewhat of a neutral position in the growing tensions in the Asia-Pacific around Taiwan, and not necessarily side with the Americans, but, be neutral or even be somewhat sympathetic to China. And if China starts actively being engaged in this war, delivering those weapons to Russia, I think even most European countries would then say, well, we can no longer even support China in all other matters.
Now, Germany has asked China to use its influence on Moscow to end the war in Ukraine. Do we have any reason to believe that China will actually do that, given that it has not condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine?
Well, exactly. So China has never called Russia the aggressor in this war. It has never asked any concessions from Russia. And so, it's hard to judge how sincere China is. In China, the war is depicted as a war that was mostly initiated by NATO expansion. So it's a proxy war where the United States fights against Russia. And so in the big picture of things, it seems pretty obvious that China here has a biased perspective and, probably is not the most ideal country to be actually a neutral negotiator for peace.
Now, the other big issue dominating the German foreign minister's trip in China is Taiwan. Baerbock warned of the dangers of escalating tensions over the island. How likely is it, Marina, that we will see an armed conflict over Taiwan, and what would that mean?
Well, unfortunately, it becomes ever more likely. Of course, there are all sorts of dates that are floating around. Some speak of 2027, others speak of later. But a lot of folks in this world are convinced that there might be clashes. The big question, of course, is how big the escalation will be. The United States is ever more firm to say they will interfere and they will protect Taiwan or be on Taiwan's side if China, for example, undertakes a blockade of Taiwan. And then, exactly as Baerbock said on her visit, it will, completely shock the world. All, like supply lines connecting China and, Europe, but also the rest of the world, they will be broken. So, like basically for no country on this planet, they can ignore this conflict.
We've seen a flurry of diplomatic activity by Europe in China, some of it focusing on Taiwan. Does Europe speak with one voice on Taiwan?
No, not at all. So there are deep divisions. And I think, the statements coming out of Brussels, speaking of China as a partner, but then also a competitor and a systemic rival, also illustrate that there's not a consensus. Because, of course, to put these three terms next to one another might seem quite as schizophrenic, but that's exactly the position. So, there's this combination of views. Some countries view it mostly as a partner. Others have this competitor function. And for others, they're very much siding with the United States and see in China a systemic rival. They don't even, want to accept the idea that China could be coming up with its own world order and are willing to contest it.
Marina, thank you very much for your insights. That was Marina Henke from the Hertie School here in Berlin. Well, Annalena Baerbock isn't the only high-profile visitor to Beijing at the moment. Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, is also on his inaugural visit to the country. He has met his Chinese counterpart, Xi Jinping. Their meeting comes a day after Lula criticized the outsized role of the U.S. dollar in the world economy and lashed out at the International Monetary Fund. The veteran leftist is seeking closer ties with his country's most important trading partner. The theme of his visit has been that Brazil is back. Since taking office in January, Lula has tried to reposition his country as a global deal broker between the East and the West.